So this is Acts chapter 1, the scripture for May 18th. And we finally finished the Gospel of Luke. That is part 1 of Luke's history of early Christianity. Part 2 is this book, The Acts of the Apostles. And Luke summarizes his Gospel before launching into the formation of the early church in its first days. That's what the first several verses of chapter 1 are all about. Now, one of the most convincing proofs of the resurrection for me are the actions of Jesus' disciples. If Jesus' disciples didn't believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, they would have stopped meeting. They would have gone their separate ways. They would have gone back to being fishermen and tax collectors and whatever occupation they may have had beforehand. But Jesus' disciples do nothing of the sort. Jesus' disciples continue to gather, continue to preach, and they in fact are so thoroughly convinced in the reality of the resurrection that they're willing to lose their lives. They're willing to talk about this Jesus Christ as if he resurrected from the dead, which if he didn't, would be kind of a rude thing to do. But they do. They're thoroughly convinced in the resurrection. And so they continue to gather. They all go to where Jesus told them that he would be ascending into heaven. And they see this awe-inspiring sight, I'm sure it was, of Jesus being carried up. And then angels telling them, let's get on with the show. So Peter, who had been the most headstrong of the 12 disciples, and who had been in Jesus' inner circle together with James and John, well, he naturally takes lead among the believers. While Jesus' family, particularly his brothers, might not have believed in his lordship early on, by this time, they, along with Jesus' mother Mary, are gathering with the believers, likely in an upper room not too different from the upper room that Jesus shared in his Last Supper with his disciples. 120 people for this fledgling church is just a little above the median size of churches in American Christianity. And I think it's mind-blowing that every Christian can trace their spiritual lineage all the way back to one of these 120 individuals. I think that's really incredible. Now Peter addresses these 120 folks, and a couple things stand out about Peter's address. Well, first, there's this note about how Judas died. And this note about how Judas died seems to disagree with Matthew's account of Judas' death. One of them, Matthew's, in one of them, Judas hangs himself. And in this one, Judas falls headlong into a field. In both cases, the field that's purchased with Judas's blood money, whether or not he actually died at that field, well, it was that field that was known as the Field of Blood. And I think that that's maybe the important point about these narratives. I know the Passion of the Christ attempts to unify these narratives by showing Judas hanging himself over this field, and then finally when the rope frays, he falls headlong. That could very well be the case, but what I think is most important for both of these authors is naming the fact that Judas was overcome with guilt, and naming the fact that people knew that this field had been purchased with blood money. Second point about Peter's address. These early Christians found prophecies about the Messiah everywhere. There was no book in the Hebrew Bible too innocuous to find prophecies about the Messiah in. Even the book of Psalms, which is understood to be a hymnal for ancient Israel, there were prophecies about the Messiah there. I think that some scholars today might question the methodology of the early church. But in spite of that, what's I think really neat to see is that this early church absolutely and fundamentally tied themselves to the authority of Scripture. Last thing about Peter's address, they came up with several benchmarks or attributes for what Judas's replacement should look like. They were really voting on a new church elder to some degree. They said, okay, this person needs to have been journeying continually with Christ over the last 3 years. This person needs to have witnessed the resurrection. But then once they narrowed it down to 2 people, they did the first century equivalent of flipping a coin. That's what drawing lots is. They acknowledged God as sovereign over random chance. I wonder, what would you think of a church which chose elders in part by drawing lots? That's all for Acts chapter 1. Tomorrow, May 19th, we'll be looking at Acts chapter 2. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.